Thank you for tuning in to Shared Hope International's Invading the Darkness, an anti-sex trafficking podcast. We want to acknowledge that the content we discuss can be emotionally challenging and may evoke strong reactions. The stories we share often involve tough subjects related to suffering caused by sex trafficking, which may be difficult for some listeners to hear. Listener discretion is advised.
Anne works on our Just Response Council here at Shared Hope International and works with Indigenous populations in Minnesota. So Anne, I'd love for you to just tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do.
Absolutely. So I am located in West Central Minnesota. I've got a little bit of the accent, so you guys will hear that as I'm speaking. And I supervise an anti-trafficking program. And then I do a lot of work with, as you had mentioned, Indigenous populations. So I have created a anti-trafficking prevention curriculum for working with Indigenous youth. I do training on the state and national levels on understanding kind of the intersections between historical trauma, current traumas, and trafficking as they impact Indigenous communities. And that's kind of how I got involved with the Just Response Council.
Amazing. Well, thank you for the work that you're doing and for adding to what we're trying to do in the field as well through the Just Response Council. I also want to mention that I have my co-host here with me today, Kim. Hey, Kim, how are you?
Hi, I'm doing great. So good to be here with the both of you.
Yes, absolutely. Let's see. I would love to start the conversation, Anne, with you talking about just the community-based youth prevention that you're doing in Minnesota. Would you mind telling us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So I can talk a little bit about my curriculum and then just kind of what Minnesota's approach looks like. So first of all, I actually was a part of the National Human Trafficking Training and Technical Assistance Center's Human Trafficking Leadership Academy. And I worked with 11 other Indigenous folks from across the United States, really talking about how culture can be used as a protective factor and as prevention against human trafficking for Indigenous youth. And so part of that project, I worked with folks across the state of Minnesota really to develop this Indigenous specific anti-trafficking curriculum. So really talking again about historical trauma, how that plays out in our lives, how that really creates additional risks for trafficking, and then also cultural activities that can really enhance those protective factors that we identified among Indigenous youth. And then in my day job, side job, whatever that may be, in my spare time, I also, as I shared, I oversee this human trafficking program in West Central Minnesota, but then we do a lot of trafficking prevention work. So we utilize Not a Number. We have utilized My Life, My Choice. We do safe dates. And then we also just go out and talk with youth who are in more high risk situations, really just about healthy relationships, consent, all of those different things that are really connected with human trafficking, but to young people may not feel like they're related. So we do a lot of that. I do a lot of training around those topics as well.
Well, Anne, I love how you're doing prevention in the field. Could you address the importance of survivor-informed responses in the field and when working with high-risk youth or CSEC verified youth?
I love this question. It makes me really happy because I think that this is where obviously we all need to be going in terms of anti-trafficking work. So I personally believe that survivor-informed responses really should be leading us when we're working with these high-risk and CSEC verified youth. So I actually found a quote that was in the roadmap that I think is a really great idea in thinking about how we work with youth. And that is really just that the roadmap is rooted in the belief that all communities are positioned to care for their members, including children and youth trafficking victims. So thinking about that inclusion there really is recognizing that folks who have experienced trafficking know all of the answers. They know what works and they know what doesn't work when it comes to services and response. And we have to listen to them when they tell us that, right? So first of all, these youth are a part of our communities. They're an integral part of our communities. And we really want that them to feel like they're included and connected. And what better way to do it than to listen to them and then to respond appropriately?
So you mentioned the roadmap report. Would you mind telling our listeners, what is the roadmap report? Why is it important to implement it in our communities? Because I am very excited when I hear things going from system-based services to community-based services. So can you just talk a little bit about that report?
Yeah, I'll do my best to answer it succinctly. So first of all, the roadmap really was created to look at different ways to support youth experiencing sex trafficking and sexual exploitation. And to this point, Shared Hope had really created a lot of tools and toolkits to be used for systems providers. And there wasn't so much information for, again, those community-based services, as you mentioned. And so this current roadmap is community-based and community-driven. And it's really an approach that I think aligns really well with these Indigenous perspectives and practices, which we'll talk a little bit more about, I think. And the recognition that youth aren't harmed in a vacuum, that healing and safety are also not achieved in a vacuum. So to work with a survivor through the system isn't really recognizing the communities that they live in, the communities that they were harmed in, and then the communities that they may be returning to after their trafficking experience. And community really is this crucial part of the process that unfortunately is often forgotten by our systems providers. So another thing is that systems really aren't designed to be with survivors throughout their entire lives. So this roadmap is really looking at how we can connect people with those community supports and how they can really help assist through this healing process. So I do want to note that we do need those systems responses and we do need our systems partners. And we also need the community responses. And I really like that the toolkit or the roadmap is really just a helpful reminder of those holistic needs of survivors. So I think it's just a great way of looking at how communities can help. And I think it's also really a great way to remind communities that they can be there as a support for survivors. And this is a kind of tool that can kind of provide that education for communities.
Yeah, absolutely. Could you maybe take it a step further and break it down for us practically in your area? So what would be the difference between a system-based response or like, care versus community-based response or care from your work in your field in Minnesota?
Yeah, I can share a little bit more about that. So I think a systems response would really just focus on the prosecutorial efforts or work done in a survivor's experience of victimization. So it would be interviewing perhaps a survivor, really going through that criminal response through the court process. And then the supports for the survivor might include mental health services, really formalized mental health services. They might include advocacy services, but they might not include advocacy, right? And then it will also just kind of look at that survivor's intersections with the criminal justice system. And the community-based is really looking at, again, those holistic needs. So maybe the survivor is connected with mental health support, but maybe they're also just connected with different group mentoring. So maybe they don't have a lot of positive youth supports or positive adult supports. And so then they're getting connected with folks in the community that can care with them, care for them, take them out, do really youth development activities with them. And that's just one example. It might be culturally responsive programming. Maybe they're Indigenous, they're going to Sweat Lodge or learning language or kind of any of those different things.
Okay, so when you talk about those culturally responsive prevention services or education, that's kind of what you do, correct? Or you kind of help to implement those things and make sure that they are culturally competent?
That would be exactly right. Really talking to folks about how they can improve those cultural responses and how to connect folks with cultural resources and also the importance of culture.
And maybe And you can relate to this in working with, tribal populations, but things as, basic needs as food, music, art, things like that that are very culturally competent can mean the world in the healing process. So can you talk about maybe some of those things when it comes to like Indigenous communities and what they need to feel seen within their culture?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So first of all, I think of you had mentioned both art and music. And so really from that Indigenous perspective, creating art. So whether that is a group maybe where young people are working on ribbon skirts or beadwork or other traditional handicrafts, which is really something that's super beneficial. Of course, we know like physically, but then also mentally. And then it's also an opportunity for youth to connect with other youth and then learn traditional teachings while they're working on those different handicrafts. So something that I learned through participating in and running different cultural art groups is that each cultural activity we have, whether it is making beadwork or it is making ribbon skirts, is that there are teachings with really every activity that we engage in. And that's something that we can teach those young people. But then there's also music, as I shared. So learning different songs, participating in drum groups. Maybe young people are learning how to dance and then are going to different powwows or big drum ceremonies or other ceremonies where they're able to kind of dance. And maybe, if like in a perfect world, I'm thinking like young people have made their own regalia, they're using it, they're engaging in these really pro-social, healthy community behaviors. So those are some really big ones that come to mind. But we know there are other different types of teachings that young people learn that can be really helpful too.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback on that just a little bit, just because something just came to mind. Mick, do you remember when we did that one sting operation? And there were
Yep.
a lot of Mandarin women. And so we really had to, shift the dynamics. It wasn't as normal when we would show up with like backpacks and American food and stuff like that. So me and Mick had to be strategic and we had to obtain, the foods that they really loved. And Mick brought in, was it your pan?
Yeah, it was a hand pan, so it was a soothing instrument. So we were able to like implement music because they were not, they weren't native English speakers. They didn't want to open up about what had just happened to them and with the sting operation that just happened. But to kind of like show them that we were safe people, we were there for them. We wanted to make sure that they felt comforted, that sometimes music can speak when words can't, right? And me as a musician, I love implementing music whenever I can in the healing process, especially like when you're starting to build rapport with people to just break that ice. So I think that cultural competency, and like Kim said, we went to the Asian market and made sure we got foods that were familiar to them, because I think just those small things can make a really big difference in the rapport building process. And so with that, Anne, I did want to ask too, that are there ways that people are coming together in your community, like a collaborative effort to make sure that there are good youth-centered prevention efforts being implemented?
Absolutely, yes. So there are a lot of different kind of youth healing groups that are being held around the community that I live and work in. And I think what's really especially important about them is that they're not always connected to anti-trafficking programs. Sometimes they are, which is wonderful, but other times it's just a space where youth can come together. They can eat food, they can learn the language, they can participate in different activities, and they're also building positive relationships with other youth who are kind of in similar backgrounds or similar scenarios as them. And I always like talk about this particular group because it was really fun for me, but I know it was really fun for youth too. So we have a few different Native specific youth groups in my community. And one time we all went to a local, one of our local homeless shelters has a native garden. And so then all of these native plants are growing in this native garden. And we brought a bus full of youth there. And then one of the program directors came out and was kind of talking with the youth about how these different native plants were previously used and how they're currently used. And so really just had some great conversations about food sovereignty, which these youth had never engaged in, and just were able to learn more about, again, homeless services in the community, about how their ancestors lived, and then spend some time trying these foods with other youth in similar backgrounds. And that was, for sure was the most fun group that I've ever participated in, just because, again, it's these pro-social behaviors and building these cultural connections. And they're not talking about victimization. They're not talking about healing, but they are healing and they are interconnected.
I love that. Pro-social behaviors. Can you kind of keep going with that train of thought? I'd love to hear more about that, especially when we're in a world where children are more disconnected than ever from one another, just by way of technology and devices. So, I'd love to hear more about that, like encouraging socialization. Is that kind of what you're
absolutely
attempting to do?
Yeah, for sure. And really just learning with each other. So I think that you said it really well, that young people are absolutely less connected, at least in physical ways, than they ever have been before. And they're spending so much more time online. And that's obviously not really representative of life and what life looks like, but it becomes normal to them. And the things that they see are normalized. And so we're really trying to encourage these activities where they come together in physical space with each other, learn how to interact in ways that are healthy. So really coming up with group norms that are meaningful, and that they can challenge each other in ways that are healthy too. So really unlearning things that they may have learned in online scenarios or online situations, and then relearning or learning for the first time how to interact with each other in healthy ways.
Yeah, that's great. We need more of that, because that in itself is prevention.
Yes,
for sure.
yes.
Less isolation, more connection, for
Yes.
sure. And I think that's a very practical community-based response right there in prevention. So thank you for implementing that in Minnesota.
So, Anne, is there any examples of unjust incarceration with tribal populations being misidentified?
Absolutely, yes. And I don't know that I can even quantify these numbers in ways that are representative, but we do know that particularly for Native women who experience incarceration, that they have experienced significant victimization prior to that incarceration, whether that is trafficking, whether that is intimate partner violence or sexual violence, or all three together. And we know Minnesota actually did a study of incarcerated women in our state prison and found that of all of the women that were incarcerated that are Indigenous, that 98% of them had experienced some form of victimization, and almost none of them had accessed any services or support for that victimization. And I think what was really profound for me was that we know 98% is a really big number, but that 2% who didn't identify just didn't answer the question. So it wasn't that they were not victims, but really just that they didn't feel comfortable or safe to really share what that victimization looked like. And I participate in a jail group here in the community that I live in, and co-facilitate this jail group, really talking about human trafficking. And what we found is that almost exclusively all of the women who are in this jail group, really regardless of background, but particularly Native women, are current survivors of some form of human trafficking, and almost never have been asked about this victimization prior to incarceration. So they're sitting in jail, they're really maintaining contact maybe with their traffickers, or something is happening with their traffickers, and nobody's identifying it, nobody's supporting them, nobody has connected with them, or even identified that that's why, maybe forced criminality or something along those lines. That's why they're currently sitting in jail until we come in with that jail group. And so it's been really awesome to be able to have those conversations with these incarcerated women and talk about services and support. But it's less awesome that we're not getting to them until incarceration. So we definitely have some work to do there, but it is something that is huge.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, this one right here just really pulls on my heartstrings, and it's why we do what we do in the field, right? And so I'm grateful for Shared Hope and, all of our resources that we have here and, the fight that we continue to do. Even with our legislators and our state leaders of our states, to try to ensure that we can get to this matter a little bit faster. Because like you said, why are we waiting until they're incarcerated to find out that this is an issue and then step in? And so for me, it's still a little backwards. And we, like you said, we have a lot of work to still do in our states.
Definitely.
Yeah. And so along those lines of identifying as soon as possible, right? I know that's something we're working on within our Just Like Me toolkit, our Just Like Me policy goals that we're really trying to focus on to end the unjust incarceration of survivors is removing some of those definitional barriers to victim identification. So do you see any particular definitional barriers that are kind of hindering that identification?
Well, I don't know if I would refer to it as a definitional barrier, but I think what I see really most often with our systems partners is that they're expecting a disclosure, and they're usually expecting a disclosure the first time they meet with someone. So, which is like a very, very rare if it ever happens. It's an anomaly. So that's kind of what we run into on a really regular basis. And they're really looking for, okay, so if this person is experiencing these things, I'm going to sit down with them. I'm going to have a conversation with them, and they're going to trust me enough to tell me the first time that they've ever met me. Maybe they're in crisis. Maybe there's a lot of things happening in their background, but they're going to tell me, because I'm a good person, that they're experiencing trafficking. So really, we have to do a lot of education around that. Still, it continues to be something that our partners really grapple with and struggle to understand. And I think that's maybe a positive shout out to all of our systems partners, is that they're all going in and they are good people, and they're thinking, I'm a good person, so they're going to share this with me, and not recognizing the barriers to disclosure. So again, it's probably not a definitional barrier, but that's what I see a lot.
Okay. And then I'd love to ask you, in your opinion, and from the work that you've done in the field, on average, how long would you say it takes for that disclosure to happen? Because I think it's just good for people to understand the why, and about how long, maybe after how many sessions or how many, weeks or months. Is there a specific timeline that you have seen on average?
For me, it's just like Kim had mentioned earlier, every survivor is different. There have been survivors I've worked with who have never disclosed. There have been survivors that I've worked with, it was 8+ years after their victimization before they decided to start talking about it as a victimization. And those were youth who had gone through some pretty significant court cases, and it was their traffickers were tried and charged as traffickers, but they still really took a long time to kind of get to that place of identification.
And I'd love to ask Kim too, if you wouldn't mind answering this. What are some reasons why? And maybe Anne, I'd love to hear your answer on this as well. But what are some reasons why they don't disclose, or they would rather not, admit to their victimization and what's happened?
Yeah, Mick, there's a lot of reasons, but it's kind of like Anna already touched on. A lot of times, first of all, we don't even know we're a victim, right? Until the definition is truly explained to us. And then there's so many layers of trauma after that. It's so much easier for us to just tend to the trauma response and not identify and not associate with that and not deal with everything that comes along with that, and just stay in our little bubble, even after we've been told. And I think a lot of times we also still are in that guilt and shame of, well, I chose this. Oh, well, this is, I went with this. It's I. And it takes a long time of undoing, all the brainwashing and the trauma bonding and the manipulation that we have been through for X amount of years, to really go back in and neurologically change the neural pathways in our brains to really grab the understanding of the trauma that we had just experienced. So there is so many different reasons. I mean, sometimes they're in fear because of all the lies that they have been fed, so sometimes they just don't want to identify and don't want to deal with it out of fear, out of, having to go through the healing process, or maybe their trafficker had told them things that that they're still walking in fear over. So there is just layers upon layers of reasons. But those are definitely I know they were my reasons of why I didn't identify for a long time. And I just didn't understand it all, right? I didn't understand what the victimization looked like, because I always thought because I chose to go with him, it was all my fault. And so I think that that's what I hear still in the field over and over and over with the victims that I serve and have the, incredible honor to walk alongside, is they still tell me, Miss Kim, I chose this life though. And in reality, they didn't choose anything.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Kim. Thank you so much for that perspective. People need to understand, especially service providers and people who haven't worked with survivors as often, need to understand the reasons why that self-disclosure might not happen for weeks, months, years. And then, Anne, I'd love to just turn it over to you if there's anything you'd like to add as to the why they'd rather not disclose.
Yeah, definitely. I think that, Kim said like everything. The only thing I would add is that what I've seen in both communities and families with intergenerational trafficking is that it's really become either a family norm or a community norm. And so then it's hard to accept for these survivors to accept that this is just not a way of life or a way of helping out the family, or just something that they have to do in order to get from point A to point B, that it's just so normalized. And then I think that once they get past that recognition that this maybe isn't super normal, there is, again, that guilt and shame that was mentioned by Kim.
Well, thank you so much for your time, your expertise, and for the work that you're doing in the field. And we really, really appreciate you. We're so grateful to have you on our Just Response Council here at Shared Hope. And we love supporting the work that you're doing and highlighting it through a podcast like this one.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure to be a part of this conversation.
Thank you for listening to Shared Hope International's Invading the Darkness podcast. You can continue to listen and watch our podcast on all streaming platforms. To learn more about what Shared Hope International is doing and take action to end child sex trafficking, please visit us at sharedhope.org.